Okay, well, I'm Dusty Deschamps, and I'm not here to talk about some character. I'm here to talk about my family. So it makes it a little easier because I don't have to make anything up. My family has been involved in Missoula activities pretty much from the earliest of times in Montana, but I'm going to go back a lot further than that. We think that our family originated in western France. The name Deschamps means of the fields in French, and it's a very common name in France. I found it all over the country. But family lore has it we came from the Normandy region, and I've done some DNA testing which tends to suggest that that might be true. But we have done some genealogical research in mostly baptismal records and marriage records in Canada, and we find that the earliest ancestor of the Deschamps arrived in French Canada about 1600. And the family was very prolific. They had lots of kids, and all their kids had lots of kids. And over the course of the next 200 years or so, the family managed to spread out throughout pretty much the eastern half of the North American continent. And so by 1800, I find our first connection to Montana. When the Lewis and Clark expedition was forming up in 1803 and 4, they recruited a bunch of French riverboatmen in St. Louis to bring them up the Missouri for that first year's expedition. The leader of the French riverboatmen out of St. Louis was a guy by the name of Baptiste Deschamps. And if you look in the Lewis and Clark journals, you'll see that. The French riverboatmen brought the expedition up to the Mandan villages for the first winter. They didn't spend the winter in the Mandan villages, but the Frenchmen were sent back to St. Louis to report on the first year's activities on the expedition. So they didn't quite make it to Montana. But not too much after that, in the early part of the 1800s, there was a lot of fur trade competition here in the western United States, in the upper Missouri in particular, and competition between the Hudson's Bay Company, the American Fur Company, and others, as well as a lot of competition between various individual fur trappers and Indians. And of course, a good percentage of these fur trappers were French Canadians. A lot of them married Indian women. And the result of that were people of mixed French and Indian blood who are known as Métis. One of the Métis families that came into eastern Montana in the 1820s and 30s was written up in this January 2004 edition of the Montana magazine, the magazine of the Montana Historical Society. And the article is entitled, "This Wicked Family." And the smaller print says, "A biography of the Deschamps family of Fort Union, their feuds, fights, and violent demise." And of course, people always get a chuckle out of this wicked family. But they were involved in a lot of battles with people, fights in front of forts that are depicted here in a Charlie Russell painting. There's a picture of a skirmish outside the walls of one of the eastern Montana fur forts. They must have been pretty good hunters and guides, though, because there was a French or a German prince by the name of Maximilian that had an expedition up the Missouri in the 1830s. Maximilian must be one of Denny Washington's 10. Maximilian had a lot of artists come along and others, but he hired a lot of people for guides and hunters for the expedition. And so one of the artists that came along painted a picture of this guy whose name was Francois Deschamps, who was the chief hunter and guide for the expedition, coming up off the Missouri to shoot a grizzly bear that's up here feeding on a bison carcass. He also painted a picture of this woman who was Francois's wife, and obviously a Native American. Well, after the expedition and some more feuds with other people, the Deschamps family got trapped in one of these forts in eastern Montana. There was a big siege and shootout, and eventually the whole family was killed. And the people that were attacking them burned the fort to the ground with the bodies in it because they wanted to be done with this, quote, treacherous and quarrelsome family. And so that ended that particular branch of the family, but luckily it wasn't my direct ancestors, or I wouldn't be here today. My direct ancestors were still in Canada, and there was a fairly large family of people that had several boys, and in the 1860s the boys decided it was time to start heading west to make their fortune. And the first one that headed west was a guy by the name of Gaspard Deschamps. Gaspard came out here in the mid-1860s and went to the gold rush at Cedar Creek, which is outside of Superior up here. And Gaspard was looking for gold. He might have wanted some gold dust, or hopefully if he could find them, some gold nuggets. Now, you can look at them, don't take any samples. But Gaspard, despite his best efforts, was not having much luck finding any gold. And so after some lack of success in the gold fields, he headed north, went up to the Flathead, and he was up there for about 5 years, we think, with the Indians. When Gaspard left the Flathead Valley, there were a number of Indians up there with the last name of Deschamps. There hadn't been any before, so we don't know exactly what Gaspard's activities were up there, but there were people that took his name. He came down to Frenchtown and married a French-Canadian woman whose last name was Cyr. And they started raising a family, and Gaspard started assembling a sizable ranch here in the Missoula Valley. And as kind of a side note, some of the other speakers will talk about how they were the only white women in Missoula in the 1860s, and make it sound like there just weren't any other women around. Well, actually, there were a lot of white women, but they were all French Canadians, and they were out at Frenchtown. And the French Canadians were always kind of viewed as second-class citizens, not too much above Indians, and certainly not the same social strata as the Anglo-Saxon English people. So you don't hear much about these French Canadians, but there were maybe as many as 80 French Canadian families in the Frenchtown area by the mid-1860s, including a lot of women and children. Well, as I mentioned, Gaspard started building his ranch, and the remnants of that are still out on Mullen Road. In fact, if you go to the Ranch Club development and golf course, and you go in the gate into that, you'll see established 1865. If you go on their website, you'll see that they're talking about Gaspard establishing that in 1865. And in fact, if you know where you're going, you can still get down to the old ranch down on the other side of the old Milwaukee right away down in there. But Gaspar was involved in not just ranching, but other commercial activities as well, including a blacksmith shop and an implement company on West Main Street. In the late 70s, the second brother, a fellow by the name of Joseph, came out here and bought Gaspar's interest in that blacksmith shop. Joseph married, had children, and his first child was this Joseph, who was born here in Missoula in 1881. And I'll come back to this Joseph in a little bit. But
did the Joseph also come from Canada?
No, his dad did, but
That's when.
but this guy was actually born here. His father's over in St. Mary's with the rest of the family, and I'll talk about that in a minute too. But the last of the three brothers was my ancestor, my great-great-grandfather. He came, although a couple of his sons had actually come out here earlier and had been here for some time before my great-great-grandfather and his wife came. But my great-great-grandfather bought part of Gaspar's ranch, this one being in the lower part of LaValle Creek on this side of the Clay Hills. And that remained, I remember that place when I was a kid. But he had children, including my great-grandfather, who took over the ranch. And he must have been a pretty decent farmer, because he got these silver medals for display of thrashed oats at the a big exposition they had in San Francisco in 1914 when the Panama Canal was opened. And he got the silver medals for that display. As I mentioned, all of these families had lots of kids, and all their kids had lots of kids. It gets kind of complicated because they've named a lot of them with the same names as their parents. So, for example, my real name's Robert III, and I've actually got a grandson that's Robert V. So I'm just as bad as the rest of them were. But turning to Joseph, who was born here, he took over his dad's blacksmith shop and operated it into the 20th century. But of course, people were losing interest in blacksmiths and more interested in making internal combustion engines run. So at some point along the way, Joseph turned the shop from a blacksmith shop into a auto mechanic, and that's basically where his career went. Joseph was also very involved in aviation and became one of the first aviators in the Missoula Valley around the time of the First World War. Joseph finally was very active in the city band, played the tuba. And there's a fellow over here in a blue shirt talking about the city band. Well, Joseph was in that band for 40 years, and when he was buried, the obituary says they had a big band celebration out here in conjunction with his interment. Joseph is the only Deschamps I know of that's buried in a city cemetery. All the rest of them are in a Catholic cemetery. And so I don't know exactly why that is. I asked my dad when he was still alive if he knew why Joseph was in the city cemetery, and he said, well, he wasn't a Catholic. The only thing I can speculate on, this is pure speculation, but Bessie may not have been a Catholic. And back in those days, if you married somebody outside the church, you were basically excommunicated. And I suspect that's probably what happened. And so he was through with being a Catholic, and that's how he ended up here. Joseph and Bessie had one son. The son was killed in an accident before he had any children of his own. So this little twig, I guess, is a Deschamps family tree, pretty much ends right here at this headstone. The rest of the family, of course, has expanded and continued to grow. But when all the brothers were here and situated, and when the railroad was constructed into Missoula in 1883, they sent back to Canada and had their parents come out here and join them. And so this is a picture of my great-great-great-grandparents taken here in Missoula in 1883. And they're the ancestors of all the Deschamps in the Missoula Missoula Valley. And because of these two being buried here, I claim to be a fifth-generation Missoulian. Now, of course, like I say, there's 2 or 3 additional generations. So that pretty much concludes my remarks about the Deschamps family. And I'd sure be happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.
Well, where were you actually when you were, after you were born? Where did you live on the ranch out there?
Well, yeah, we lived out there. The place east of town, my grandfather actually bought in 1945, and we moved out there right after he bought it. My grandfather was involved in real estate and did pretty well in that real estate business after the war, World War II. And his scheme was to do a big subdivision out east of town. That's why he bought it. But we continued to own the place west of town until late 40s, early 50s. Kind of a side note, the original town site of Hellgate was on that property. And in 1948, my dad tried to give it to the city of Missoula. And a committee was formed to try to raise money to take it over. Ty Robinson was the chair of the committee. You won't know about that from reading the Missoulian because the ACM owned all the papers in those days. But I've got quite an article about it in the Spokesman Review. In fact, when I was a kid, I wondered why we got the Spokesman instead of the Missoulian. Well, the Spokesman would cover stories that the ACM, for whatever reason, didn't see fit to print. Anaconda Copper Mining Company. They owned all the papers in Montana, along with a lot of other stuff, including perhaps the legislature.
How big was the place out west?
Oh, I don't know. Couple hundred acres, maybe. I don't know. But it went down to the river, and the north side was more or less where the Milwaukee Road was. The Hellgate Trading Post is where that was, and like I said, I remember the town site. All the buildings were still there. I mean, they were only 80 years old at that point. And but the city couldn't raise enough money to take it over, and eventually my dad sold it to somebody and it turned into a trailer park. And the buildings were all raised. Nowadays, of course, we'd probably, have some major project to try to preserve it, but that wasn't the thing in those days. If it was 40, 50 years old, it was old, let's get rid of it and put something new up. And
the placer gold that you passed around, is that from Cedar Creek?
The what? No.
No. Okay.
Actually, my wife's got a similar heritage to mine, and it's a long story. But she had when her parents died, had a safety deposit box, and in the safety deposit box was this, and I don't know why I'm doing this, but I grabbed it a double eagle.
Oh yeah, I used to mine on Cedar Creek as well. It was one
And this you may have noticed on that display, kind of a copper thing on the front. Right here. I only had one of them. At times I put the mirror in behind it so you can see the back. But if you look at the one in the plastic, it's not gold. I think it's bronze or brass, one or the other.